Well, this morning I'm transitioning from where we were in these last few Sundays with Palm Sunday, Good Friday, Easter, and leading up to the time of the cross and the grave and the victory over the grave. I wondered, where do we go from here? And I wanted to go back to where we were as a family of believers here. We've been asking this question for a while now. Who is Jesus? As we go through the gospel according to Mark, and we look at how Mark portrays who Jesus is. And I wanted to transition from what we just came through last weekend to where we were before all this and try to tie that together for us in a way that I think will help us re-engage in the story of Christ and seeing how what he has done and what Mark is talking about will be able to continue to paint that picture for us of who Jesus is. So I'm going to be reading from John chapter 18, and our sermon, and then I'm going to be reading from Mark 2, because this is where we left off. The title for our message today is, What did Jesus mean? And we're going to be looking at that from the different passages that we're going to be reading today. What did Jesus mean? So look at John 18, verse 36 with me. As he was before Pilate, being tried for his life, Jesus gave this reply to Pilate. He said, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from this world. That's one of the things that we're going to ponder this morning. And then we're going to pick up where we left off in the book of Mark at chapter 2, starting at verse 18. Mark 2 at 18, we'll go through verse 22. Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came to him and said, Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said to them, Can the wedding guests feast or fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it, and the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins. What did Jesus mean? And those are good questions for us to ask. Questions are always good for learning. Our children learn that way. When they're little, if you have little kids at home, or if you've got grandkids in the family, you maybe even remember your own days when you did this. Kids will ask questions, why? And you give them an answer, and they'll ask why to that, and they just keep asking more questions. It's not that they're trying to annoy you as much as it might. They're trying to learn. They're trying to gather information. What's that? What's that? I was reading a book to my granddaughter before all this started, and we had to separate ourselves. And every time I would turn the page, she put, "What's that? What's that?" And I know she knows the answer. But she's trying to learn. She's trying to have that idea, whatever that was. She wants that solidified in her mind. What is that? When will we be there? That whole idea of the journey. Are we there yet? Can I have some? I've got a grandson that asks that question anytime food comes out. Can I have some of that? We ask questions. We're trying to learn. We're trying to expand our minds and our understanding of things. And that's what we're going to do here. And Jesus is one that uses questions as well to get people to learn and understand things as well. And some of those pop up here. But Jesus said from John 18, my kingdom is not of this world. What does he mean? What does he mean? My kingdom is not of this world. No one's ever thought of a kingdom outside of this world with all the different rulers that have ever been. They all rule over time and space in this world. Now there are mythical gods that are the gods of this and that and land and sea and fertility and crops and all that kind of thing. These so-called gods, but kingdoms are always physical kingdoms. And Jesus said, my kingdom isn't of this world. So I wanted to just unpack that a little bit. If Jesus' kingdom is not of this world, what does a worldly kingdom look like? What does the kingdom here on earth look like? Well, they all have common problems. And one major, I was trying to, there's so many problems with earthly kingdoms. And to try to narrow it down without missing any, I thought was going to be nearly impossible. They all have a common problem. They're all natural. All of the kingdoms of this earth are natural kingdoms. And by that I mean they are here in time and space. They exist in nature, in what we see around us. They are physical kingdoms with places and people and buildings and structures and towers and thrones, all these types of things. They have laws in them. They are governed by the things that we see here on this earth. They are natural. So they're limited by time. When you think of an earthly kingdom, and there have been many, you think of some of the earliest kingdoms as you record them, as they're recorded in history, or if you read some of the kingdoms that existed during the days of Abraham, Moses, David, the people of Israel, all the different kingdoms that existed. They don't exist. That kingdom doesn't exist anymore. Time is one of the major problems with kingdoms here on earth. Even if you could have a long-standing perpetual kingdom, some of the Chinese dynasties that go back thousands of years, time is still a problem because we are in this natural world. Time is a problem. So from one ruler to the next, when you have one king that rules, because there's time in these kingdoms, with enough time passing, that king will die. And the king no longer rules. And so an heir or somebody else comes in and takes over. And maybe the ruler of that kingdom was a good ruler. And then his son takes over, or somebody else comes in and takes over, and they're an awful ruler. And they lead their kingdom poorly. We even see examples of that in the kingdoms of Judah and Israel, where you look at King David, a man after God's own heart, the chosen king of Israel, when the people were crying out for a king other than God, God answered their request and gave them kings that would continue to rule over them. And David was that model king that God had put in place. But David died. And Solomon begins to reign. And Solomon has his issues. And other sons begin to reign. And with time, they all die. And somebody else has to take their place. Or maybe the kingdom is taken over. And that happens as well. Somebody comes in and takes over the kingdom. You also have to deal with not only the death of the king, but what do you do about the death of other people that rule? What do you do about death in general? Because if enough of your people die out, what does your kingdom look like? They all have to deal with the limitations of time and death, of war that might overthrow one king and the kingdom is taken over by another. Those are just all some of the natural problems that are part of the kingdoms of this world. And every one of them has to somehow deal with the problems that naturally occur in this world. Problems of sin, natural disaster, death, disease, famine, all those things. How do the rulers of those kingdoms deal with those things? Because they have to. And that's where we find ourselves today. The rulers of the different kingdoms of this earth, as you might call them, are trying to figure out, what do we do with this coronavirus? What do we do now? How do we handle this? And every kingdom has to make those decisions, because that's a part of the natural world that every kingdom exists in. My kingdom is not of this world, Jesus said. In fact, Jesus fought against the idea of people trying to make him a king while he was here on earth. After Jesus had fed the 5,000, Jesus perceived that they were wanting to take him by force and make him their king. They understood that he was a good prophet, a good leader, certainly one that would provide for them. And Jesus saw that they were about to take him by force and make him their king. But their understanding of the kingdom was still not a correct one. They hadn't understood what Jesus was trying to show them about what his kingdom would look like. And so he withdrew from that place. Even when Jesus is being arrested and Judas is betraying him, Peter takes out his sword trying to stop all this madness, and he takes a sword and he slashes off the servant of the high priest. He slashes off his ear. And Jesus said, "Put away your sword. Those that live by the sword die by the sword." If you're going to resort to what's natural in this world and fighting for those types of things, you're limited to what you can do, what your understanding of the kingdom is. He never wanted people to make him the king the way they thought he would be a king. Even the disciples, as Jesus continued to try to teach them, when will your kingdom be? When will you do all these things? They were tired of being oppressed by the Romans, and they wondered, when will Jesus step in and take the throne here on earth and begin to rule and reign? But he continued to say, my kingdom is not of this world. See, Jesus' kingdom is not limited by time. Jesus' kingdom is an eternal kingdom. It started before time began. The kingdom that Jesus is putting into place, that he is advancing to the next stage in his ministry, is one that was planned out before time even began. Even all of the ways that Jesus would have to suffer and die, the whole plan of his conquering sin for us, all of that was planned out before time began. It's an eternal kingdom. And it's one that's ruled by one king. There haven't been a succession of kings throughout time to take the place of somebody else. There's always been one king. God has always been king of his kingdom. And Jesus, as God in the flesh, is inheriting that kingdom and rules as the one true eternal king. It's also one that's ruled with perfect justice in comparison to every other kingdom on earth. Every other kingdom has its flaws. Every other kingdom is subject to corruption and bribery, slander, all kinds of things that are going to change the dynamics of the way people rule. If you pay me enough money, I will give you a ruling in your favor. That has happened throughout time. Kings and judges become corrupt in the kingdoms that they serve. But Jesus' kingdom is one that perfect justice always happens. There's never been a time where Jesus gave, or God through the prophets have given, an unjust judgment. In fact, just the opposite happens. Not only is he perfectly just, he is also full of grace and mercy. And in every other kingdom, they rule typically with an iron fist, and there are laws set in place, and if you break those laws, you have to be punished, and that's the beauty of Jesus' kingdom. There's grace and mercy in there, and you and I, we don't deserve to be citizens of his kingdom, but because of the cross, because of an empty grave, because he sits enthroned with his Father now, we are able to be part of his kingdom because his grace and mercy is so abundant. He always makes allowance for those people who are weak and disadvantaged. Most of the other kingdoms try to figure out how to do away with and keep them out of the picture. Weakness and disadvantage doesn't look well for a kingdom. But in Jesus' kingdom, he turns everything upside down, and he uses the weak. He uses the disadvantaged people as some of the primary people in advancing his kingdom. Things that don't make sense in any other circumstance. It's built on perfect love. Where so many other kingdoms are built on fear, dictatorships and communism in different places, they try to bring you to a place of fear so you won't go against what they want. Now, it's not that Jesus' kingdom doesn't have laws, but it's not built on fear. It's built on love. If we continue to love him, we would want to keep his commandments. And as we keep his commandments, his love continues to pour out on us. And even when we are unfaithful in keeping what he has asked us to, love still rules the day. That's what we celebrated last weekend. Love poured out for the sins of the people, even those that turned their backs on him. The perfect love of Christ sacrificing himself on the cross is what rules in his kingdom. It's a kingdom built on redemption. It's a kingdom built on redeeming sin and death and pain, disease, and even time itself. All of these things will be redeemed and are in the process of being redeemed even now. It's a kingdom that is established, but it isn't fully present yet. And we live in these days of tension, like here in this place where the sanctuary is empty, and it brings us to a place of tension and longing for what we don't have anymore. The same is true in Jesus' kingdom. There is this longing for what it will be one day, but isn't yet. Jesus' kingdom isn't of this world. It's a much better kingdom, established on much better principles, the perfect principles to establish a kingdom. And then we go to that passage where we left off in Mark. Where it says, then they will the days will come, then they will fast. And that's kind of where we find ourselves as well, as we consider where we're at in the story of Jesus' life. Jesus has died. He's been taken away. He's not with his disciples. And there's this longing for the presence of Jesus to be with them again. There will be a day coming when they will fast, but it wasn't then. When Jesus was saying this to his disciples, as this question was being asked, how come they fast and your disciples don't fast? Jesus said there will be a time when they fast, but it isn't now. When Jesus was on earth with them, it wouldn't be then. How could they fast when they have the bridegroom there? Fasting has always been associated with times of humbling oneself and seeking the presence of God in this solemn fashion, covered with sackcloth and ashes many times, crying out in prayer, seeking guidance from God, looking for direction, but in this place of humility and great need. Fasting has always been associated with that very solemn aspect of it. Why wouldn't your disciples fast when everybody else does? Jesus said, well, now's not the time because I'm providing everything that they would get from a fast. They wouldn't do that when I'm here with them. If you're fasting to seek the presence of God and he's with you, you wouldn't need to fast. If you're there trying in humility coming before him, now's not the time for solemn humility. It's a time to celebrate that Christ is here. Can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? But when he's taken away, and the disciples, can you imagine those few days in between his death and resurrection? when Christ was taken away, that was a time for them to reflect in solemn mourning and fasting. Even with Jesus being ascended into heaven, which is something that we look forward to and celebrating here as a church, Jesus is still not present with them in that bodily sense anymore. And there are times when the disciples are trying to understand, how do you make sense of the kingdom that they live in? How do they begin to grow in their understanding of Jesus' kingdom compared to the kingdoms that they've always seen all their lives? Their normal idea of a kingdom. How do they begin to understand what Jesus' kingdom is and then to fulfill their calling in that kingdom? Because it's a kingdom that they've never participated in until Jesus came and established it for them. Time will come when they will fast. And they need to, in those days when they're fasting, to continue to shift their thinking from what they've always thought of as kingdoms before to what the kingdom would be like. What were they expecting? What will God expect from them? What did Jesus call them to do? How do we carry that out? Those times when you're at a loss, even in days like this, when we're trying to make sense of what it is to be the people of Jesus Christ. How do we do this? How do we get through these days? These are days that we can still be in that time of lamenting for what we don't understand. We've not gone through this before. And how do we make sense of it? These, for us people as Christians now, these are good days for us to fast. And if you're able to do that, now is a good time to fast and pray for how Jesus will reveal to you and I how we can make His kingdom grow through these times of chaos and uncertainty. There will be times like these when we need to plead before our God, humble ourselves before Him, and ask for His direction. And maybe in these times too, because fasting, part of fasting in the history of God's people has been about that humbling themselves and confessing their sins. We have all kinds of time to reflect on everything in these days. And one of the things that we should reflect on as it pertains to the church is there's something that we need to confess in these times. Are there things that we need to bring before our God and take ownership of so that when we have done that, we can be set free from those things that have held us captive that Jesus wants to free us from and redeem those things as well. Jesus was trying to bring together two ideas, and this is where that section ends, and it's this awkward way of ending that passage. And he talks about putting on a new patch on an old garment, or putting new wine, unfermented wine, into an old wineskin, and the problems that causes. And it seems to come in this most awkward place. But Jesus is trying to show what His kingdom would be like and what the people would need to understand and the teachings they would need to accept, because you can't have the new teachings of Jesus that says it's only by the death of one perfect righteous man that dies for the sins of the people. It's only through that people come into and are citizens of the kingdom. It isn't on the things that people say you have to do. It's not on what you can accomplish. It's on what Jesus accomplished for you. And you have to have that new sense of teaching. You have to firmly believe that. But you have to then put that with the new kingdom as well. You have to take what Jesus was teaching, trying to change people's minds from what they always thought, and it still exists in our world today, that if I'm good enough, then I'll get to heaven. Maybe we fall back into that even as Christians. If I just stay good enough, then God will continue to show love to me, but I think He might be upset with me because I'm not this way and I'm not that way, and they forget about His grace and His mercy. Yes, we are supposed to continue to follow Him, but His love and His grace and mercy overrules those that put their hope and trust in Him. So we need to take His new teaching, the teaching that He is the only way, it's based on what He does, and put that with a new kingdom, that it's It's not like any other earthly kingdom. Everything will be redeemed. And even in these kinds of days, even when we find ourselves in situations like this, Jesus is still in the process of redeeming the world that we live in. And one day it will be. So that brings us to our last point of pondering this morning. Where's our focus in all of this? If Jesus is setting up a kingdom that is unlike any other kingdom, if he's trying to redeem all the different circumstances of our world and bring it under his control, which already is, but one day will be fully redeemed, how do we live today? Where's our focus today, especially in days like these? In these days of trouble and uncertainty? What are you concentrating on? Where's your focus? There's so many of us that focus on what's being said to us. All the facts and figures, all the different numbers that are associated with this coronavirus. And what does that mean? Are we getting worse? Are we getting better? What does this mean for me? How long before we can get back to work? These are all important things for us to figure out, and these things will find their place in time. But is that what we're focused on? Are we focused on the things around us right now? Just our circumstances? Are we a bit like Peter, who when Jesus calls him out of the boat in the middle of a raging storm, at one point he's got his eyes fixed on Jesus, but then he focuses on everything else around him, and that undoes his faith at the moment. And Jesus needs to save him. Are we focused on our circumstances so much that's what fills our minds? That's what shapes us? Are we being molded by what we see around us, or is there a different focus that we have? Are we focusing on the chaos? Are we focusing on the despair and the sickness and the death? Are you focused on the political leaders and what they're going to do, what they're saying? Are you hoping that if they would get things right, then the world would be back to normal again and we would be in this place of peace? Are you focused on all of that? Or do you focus on the King who has everything in his control? Is your focus on what is beyond what you can see and focusing on the reality of things? Because what we see is not always the reality of our circumstances. And we need to realize that. God's plan of redemption is continuing to unfold just as he said it would, just as he promised, just as he ordained it to be. This does not interrupt his plan at all. This is not outside of his control. This doesn't mean that we need to throw up our hands and wonder, what is God going to do about this? He certainly doesn't throw up his hands, and we as Christians wouldn't need to do that either. Our focus is on the one who has the end already planned. He announces the end from the beginning. He already knows. And is your focus there? I know you probably want to get back to work, and we all know we want to get back together as family and friends and as believers, and those are good things. But are we focused on who's going to make that happen, or is this death going to get so bad that it wipes out? Are we focused on our circumstances, or are we focused on the reality of the kingdom that is being put in place that isn't quite visible yet, and yet the ruler is there? We're still in this place of lament, it seems. I know we came through Lent already, and we're to the cross, and we're through the grave and the empty tomb, and we're at this place of rejoicing, but there's still something that ties us back to this time of lament, where the kingdom that we would like to have in place doesn't quite exist fully yet for us to see. So if your focus is on the people of this world that you hope will make this place a better place for you to live now, and that's it, then we've missed, as Christians, where we need to be focusing. And if we as Christians are focusing on all those types of things around us, what will people that are wondering what to do in these times, where will they focus? But if we have our eyes fixed firmly on Jesus, who already conquered sin and death and grave disease, he's already paid the ransom for all of that, so one day when he comes back, it will all fully be redeemed. If that's our longing, and that should be our longing, brothers and sisters. These days ought to make us long for the days when everything comes under the final rule and reign of Christ's kingdom, and death and disease and sickness are no more, as we have sung about and read about already. We are in a time of lamenting for what isn't yet, but will be. But we don't lament from a place of hopelessness. That's what the cross and the grave gave us. An eternal hope and security. That no matter what happens in this world, it cannot undo our faith, and it cannot separate us, and it cannot remove us from the kingdom of God if we are citizens of His, if we believe in Jesus Christ. So brothers and sisters, I pray that as we continue in these days for as long as they are, that you will remember that whether you live here in the United States, whether you live in another country, if you're members of a mountain kingdom, whether you are in a warm climate or a cold climate someplace around the world, it doesn't matter where you are, we are citizens. If you are a believer in Jesus Christ, you are a citizen of His kingdom. And these days will all be redeemed. That's what Jesus meant when He said, "My kingdom is not of this world." We have an eternal hope, one that is secured and one that will be revealed in the last days. I pray that's our longing. That we long not for the days that we can just get back to work, but we long for the days when Jesus comes again and ushers in His kingdom in its fullness. And where all those that have put their faith in Jesus Christ we will be joined together with them to glorify our God forever and live in a place where none of these things that any earthly kingdom still finds itself troubled with. We have an eternal hope as members of His kingdom, and that should be our focus at all times. Would you pray with me?